Okay, so recording has started. If you do have a question, what you can do is put it in the chat box to the lower right-hand corner, and Francis will be able to answer it at the end of the presentation. Or you can unmute yourself and ask the question at the end. If you could keep yourself muted throughout the presentation, that would be great, just to avoid distractions. So let me give an introduction to Francis, and then I will turn it over to her. Francis McNamara is author of Nutshell Murder Mystery, Molasses Murder in a Nutshell, featuring Frances Glessner Lee, mother of forensics, and set in Boston in 1919. Book 2, Three-Decker Murder in a Nutshell, is set in East Boston. Also, the Emily Cabot Mysteries, about a social activist in Chicago in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Death in a Time of Spanish Flu is set in Chicago in 1918 as World War I ends, is the 9th book in the series. Retired from the University of Chicago, she now divides her time between Boston and Cape Cod. With that, I will turn it over to Francis.
Okay, thank you. So as I was saying, a fun thing about writing historical mysteries or historicals is that you have all this extra information that you have to sort of leave out of the book. So it can be fun to talk about when you're getting people to read about the book. So I had written the 9 books when I was living in Chicago. I retired back to Boston where I grew up, and I wanted to do a set of books set in Boston. And I had heard of Frances Glessner Lee because, as you'll see, she grew up in Chicago. And I knew she was known as the mother of forensic science and was famous for having made miniature crime scenes that were used to train detectives for a long time. So when I found out that she was in Boston in 1919, I thought, well, that's a good start. And I could have up to like 18 books based on the different little crime scenes. So I'm going to talk about her and let you know a little about her, who's the main protagonist in my books. So first, the 2 books. Nutshell Murder Mystery Book 1 started a new series. I did want to use Boston. I grew up here. My father was a police commissioner for a while. He loved to walk around the north end of Boston. And there was a famous molasses flood in January of 1919 in Boston when there was this big tank of molasses that was actually used for ammunitions in World War I to make ammunitions. They brought it up from the Caribbean. They pumped it into this tank, and then trucks would come and get it and take it to a refinery in Cambridge. Well, one day in January 1919, it exploded and 21 people were killed. Some buildings were washed away. And that is such a dramatic thing that it was a great backdrop for a first mystery in Boston. The main protagonist I'm going to talk about, Frances Glessner Lee, and the medical examiner, Jake McGrath, they were real people at the time who were really interesting people too. The second book continues the series, and it's called The Three-Decker Murder in a Nutshell. You'll see that it's actually based on a nutshell that was the 2-story nutshell. But when I was writing about East Boston, one of my writing critique members pointed out that they're all 3-deckers around here, so it became the 3-decker. It's set in East Boston in November 1919. Characters are real Glessner Lee and George McGrath. I have also some characters based on my ancestors who lived there around that time too. And then plenty of fictional characters in these books too. But let's talk about who was Frances Glessner Lee. How could she be a protagonist in a murder mystery? Well, she was born in 1878 in a wealthy family in Chicago. They lived in the Glessner House, which was built in, I think, about 1886 after the Haymarket riots. And it's a Richardson building. And it's a renovated historic house that you can visit and take a tour. And I had a friend who was a docent there. So they were a very nice cultured family. They supported the arts, but they were like upper middle class. He was made money in some of the industries there at the time. She was married at the age of 19 and divorced in 1914 when she had 3 children. Her parents were quite liberal minded, and she could have gone to college if she wanted to. She was brought up and educated with her brother I think they had tutors in the house. But she herself decided that she wanted to get married, and she got married. She had 3 children, but she had an amicable divorce in 1914, and her husband still remained uh, friendly with the family and stayed in Chicago. But she was not satisfied. It wasn't totally satisfied. One of the things she did when she was still living in Chicago was she made some miniatures. So her parents were very friendly with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and they used to invite them to parties at their house, and they'd do some entertaining. So for her parents' anniversary, she actually did a huge miniature of the whole symphony orchestra. And those are just a few of the figures from the symphony orchestra. The orchestra conductor wrote by hand the little scores that are on the things. And later she did a quartet that she and her son would go and watch this quartet play and decide how to make the miniatures. Mrs. Thorne I mentioned because in the Chicago Art Institute, there's a whole set of miniature rooms that were they're called the Thorne rooms. Mrs. Thorne, who was a neighbor. So it was something that women did at that time. But by 1919, World War I is going on. Frances Glessnery hasn't really found her place in the world, kind of thing. But in Chicago, the Great Lakes Naval Training Station was just north of Chicago, and they used to invite the young men down because they were away from home, and they'd have dinners for them. And she did that, and she did that very well. So her mother, with her group that was sending money to Boston for a home for returning soldiers, suggested her as someone who could be the resident manager there. So that actually it was because when the soldiers first came home, there was the flu epidemic and everything else. They were having a hard time connecting back with their families. So they said, well, stop them in Boston, give them a place to stay, and then help them connect up before they come home. So in 1919, she was running the Wendell House in Boston. You can see it now on the corner of Hancock and Mount Vernon Street. It's condos now, but it was a returning home for soldiers. And she prided herself in making it a comfortable home for them. Her mother was very good with decorating and that type of thing. So she was following in her mother's footsteps and felt good about that. Now, George Jake Burgess McGrath was the medical examiner for Boston, and he was quite a character. This is a picture of him over here, and then this is actually a picture from the molasses flood in the North End, and he was indeed the person who at the Suffolk morgue was where they brought the bodies. I'll just read you a little bit of this. He lived in the St. Botolph Club, which was on Newbury Street. And he was a confirmed old bachelor, and he was quite a character. So some people wrote some poems about him. And this one is, by the Swanboat Public Gardens, looking eastward to the sea, there's the Botolph Club a-settin', and I know she thinks of me. For the Ritz is full of palm trees and taxi drivers roar. Drive you hack, you old Botolpher, drive you back to number 4. So it was 4 Newbury Street. Drive you back to number 4, etc. McGrath knocks at the door. His curly hair is yellow, and his Windsor tie is green, and his name is Jake McGrath, boys. Yes, just the same as Gunga Din. And I seed him first a smoking of a whackin' crackin' pipe, like a saintly Aloysius at a dish of even tripe. And they do talk about On the Road to Number 4, which was Batoff Club, where there's art and literature, because they did specialize there in art. So he was quite a local character. He lived from 1870 to 1938. He was Suffolk County Medical Examiner 1907 to 1936. He went to Harvard, which is where he was a fellow student of Francis Glessner Lee's brother. And he went to visit them in Chicago, and he visited them up in the New Hampshire at the Rocks. He was sang in the Handel and Haydn Society. He rowed with the Union Boat Club, and this is a picture of the boat club at that time. It's still on the Esplanade, the Union Boat Club. This is a picture of the mortuary, which was on North Grove Street, which is a street you go in now if you're going into Mass General Hospital. He taught medical school legal medicine for second and third year students. He was famous for cases. He often was called on to do court cases. The Summer Street Bridge, this was an accident that took place before the molasses flood, and it was over where the seaport is now, going across Fort Point Channel. There was a trolley that would run on Summer Street, and one night it just jumped the tracks and went into the water, and like 47 people died. So he was in charge of looking at the dead bodies for that one. He rode around town, and I use this in the books, in a 1907 Model T, which was called Suffolk Sioux. And he had rigged it up with bells and whistles and lights, so he could go to a scene of a crime and look at it. And he was known for riding around in this rackety old Model T. In the Sacco Vanzetti case, which would have been like 1920, 21, 22, he examined the guard who was shot at the shoe factory and matched the bullets to the Sacco pistol. He also later in 1927, this is a copy of the letter inviting him to the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. And I believe he looked at the bodies afterwards. He taught Harvard medical students. He probably did autopsy 21,000 deaths and was in 2,000 court cases. And this is a letter in 1918 that he sent to Harvard Medical School. So you didn't have forensic science at that time. You didn't have CSI like we're used to. In fact, the policeman would go in and, muck up the crime scene. And he wanted to change that. He thought that doctors needed to understand more about the legal ramifications of finding a dead body, an unexplained death. And he also thought that detectives needed to know how to stay away from the body until the doctor looked at it, and preserve the scene of a crime to find out the cause and manner of death was what the medical examiner needed to provide. So this was a letter to Harvard Medical saying, I am eager to make the presentation of this subject in the Harvard University Medical School the best thing of its kind in this country. My official work not only endows me with rich opportunity, but likewise through the contact with the body politic of physicians incidental to it, convinces me of the stirring need of its wider use for educational purposes. Again, I have no need to comment with you on the low status of medical jurisprudence in this country and on the meagerness of instruction therein offered by our medical schools. This community is one of the very few in which scientific medicine is officially applied to the use of the law, and it ought to be the one in which the principal institution of medical research and instruction transcends all others in the field of medical knowledge. So he was pushing the need for this kind of training, and that's 1918, but 10 years later, by 1929, it had been reduced to a few lectures at the end of a course in pathology. Now, Frances Glessner Lee, how did she get into it with him? So here's he over here with his pipe and all. and this is Frances Glesnerly older. In factual terms, it's believed that in 1929, Lee and McGrath were both at Massachusetts General Hospital recuperating from surgery. And at that time, they must have been stuck together. And he really talked her ear off about the need for this kind of legal medical training for both the law enforcement people and for the doctors, and the need for medical examiners as opposed to the old coroner system. And this really got to her. She became fascinated. And as you will see, this became her life to follow up on this and learn more about it and become an advocate. So Harvard Department of Legal Medicine. So we said that Jake McGrath was an old friend of Lee's brother. In 1930, Frances Glesnerly's uncle had no children of his own, and he left her money. So she had money before, but not really her own money. And then within the next couple of years, her father died and split his money between her and her brother. And then her brother died and she got that money. So the money that she had, she used to endow, in 1931, a chair of legal medicine. And Jake McGrath was appointed to that chair of legal medicine. She began to buy books and created a library of legal medicine for Harvard. In 1936, McGrath retired because he was sick and he died in 1938. She gave $250,000 endowment in McGrath's name. So there was a new academic department, the Department of Legal Medicine, the first such in the country. He dies in 1938, and the next person in charge is named Moritz. And he first goes over to Europe, where they were doing more forensics than we were over here at that time, and learns a lot there, comes back, and they set up a department with a lot of laboratories where they can do various things, ballistics, fingerprints, all those types of things that we think of as forensics were just coming into existence at that time. An example, besides the little crime scenes that she did, there were various other things that she did. So here's an example. In 1940, these were chest plates. So she had a passion for forensic science. So she made a series of ceramic plates that illustrate the wound patterns caused by gunshots with different weapons at different distances. And these particular chest plates were part of a larger one and these were done with a Smith & Wesson 38. So as you'll find out later, all of the materials for the legal department eventually wound up in the medical examiner's office in Maryland. But they were at Harvard and they were used for training. So the training, also in the 1930s, Lee went around the country advocating for the medical examiner system as opposed to the coroner. So a coroner was a more political position. It was someone who didn't necessarily have any medical background, who was in charge of unexplained deaths. And Lee was following up on McGrath's ideas that it needed to be a medical examiner. So some of the big cities started having medical examiners. I think even today there are still some coroners around the country. 18 Tiny Deaths is about the miniatures I'm going to talk about a little bit. Bruce Goldfarb, he was the public relations person at the Maryland medical examiner's office, and when he wrote that book, and it's about it's really very much about her going out there and pushing the idea of a medical examiner versus coroner. She was into training detectives and so forth, and she was spending more and more time at the Rocks, which was the family estate in New Hampshire, and she eventually was named a state police captain, and she was proud of that. And the police would call her captain a lot of times. So 46 to 48 is when she actually created these tiny crime scenes. The Rocks was this wonderful big old house. Since she was a child, they had been coming here in the summer to New Hampshire. And but in the 40s, this is after McGrath had died, she's working with the Department of Legal Medicine. She decides to build these little crime scenes. She does it up there. It have meticulous detail in all of these little crime scenes, and she hires a carpenter. She does a lot of the work herself for the nutshell studies of unexplained death. So there actually is a book. This was actually the first time I heard of these, because at Glesner House they had a session on it, and this photographer had just recently put out the book, Kareem Botts, The Nutshell Studies of Unexplained Death, which has pictures of all of the little crime scenes. The crime scenes were never public. They were only used to train detectives. A few years ago, I think it was 2017, they went to the Smithsonian to get repaired, and there was a public showing of them in the Renwick Gallery. Unfortunately, I didn't get to that, but now they're back at Maryland again, and it's only by you, they're not open to the public. This is a picture of the one that my first book is about, which is the dark bathroom. So in 1946, she made 10, 1948, 7 more, and there's one more, so there are about 18. Only one is based in a real crime. They're composites. You don't solve them. They're used to train detectives who are learning to look for clues. And in the training sessions, the 2 detectives would be given 90 minutes with a little script of information about how the body was found and what a couple of witnesses had said. But they didn't have an actual solution as such. So the term nutshell comes from an old law enforcement phrase that was convict the guilty, clear the innocent, and find the truth in a nutshell. And that is what sums up what these were used for. So these are examples of some of the nutshells, pictures of them. And then this is, she became sort of famous. And that's either Life or Newsweek or something, that she was on the cover one time when she was 69. So where were they used? What happened was the Harvard medical jurisprudence legal medicine department started to run seminars twice a year. So these were open to policemen from around the country, and they came from all parts of the country. They ran seminars twice a year. They ran from 1945 to 1967. And then they disbanded the Harvard Legal Medicine Department, and they moved the little nutshells to Maryland. And this group continued to meet, and they have like an ongoing organization that's the alums, of people who went to these trainings. So part of the training would have been analyzing the little crime scenes. She provided notes laying out certain aspects. They were extremely meticulous, these crime scenes, and gave them approximately 90 minutes. They used a geometric search pattern, so working clockwise in a contracting spiral, applied to crime scenes to ensure no evidence was missed. She said that she wrote them as an exercise in observing, interpreting, evaluating, and reporting. So again, it was more to get their observing, and it was a way to do it that they weren't actually walking into a crime scene and stomping all over the place. By having the small but meticulously accurate little rooms, they could get an idea of what they should be doing when they were at a crime scene themselves. Now, these were given twice a year. Here's her sitting in the corner here for this one. This was Harvard Medical School, the 14th seminar. And she would, at that point, she was living a lot in the estate up in New Hampshire. She still had a place, I think, back in Chicago. When she came to Boston for these, she would stay at the Ritz-Carlton, which was on Arlington Street, right opposite the Public Gardens. And she would have a dinner at the end of it for her boys there. And she even had her own set of plates of china that was specifically for this, that was kept by the Ritz. And it was all done, with the flowers and everything exactly as she wanted. The food, she had made sure they had really good steaks for them. She told them that the wine and liquor could flow freely unless somebody was talking too loud, and then they should stop serving them. So she enjoyed doing those all the time. So I took that background and thought, what if the stories are set in the 20s? What if it's when she's just learning about this legal medicine? She's not searching around, taking care of men coming back from the war, but not really she was concerned about being thought a rich woman with not enough to do with her time. She didn't really have a place. She envied McGrath, his medical degree and so forth, but she could have gone for that when she was younger because she was wealthy and so forth, but she didn't. So what if she was learning with him during that time period? What if the stories that she learned from him then became the nutshells later? So rather than having the nutshells set in the 40s, I have them set in the 20s. The first one is in January 1919. Lee and McGrath are the main protagonists. But what happens is there's a young woman who's a housekeeper for the house that Frances Glessner Lee is running. And she goes to find her sister in a rooming house, and she finds her sister, and her sister's dead in the bathtub. But then all of a sudden, everything gets washed away by the molasses flood. And after the molasses flood, she wants them to find out who really killed her sister, because her sister wasn't killed by the molasses; she was killed by by someone else. She was murdered. And a young man who's in the house that Frances Glessner Lee is taking care of is a suspect in the murder. He gets arrested at one point. So she becomes involved with trying to find the real murderer. So that is the first one. The second one, actually, Glessner House. So Glessner House in Chicago, they do tours and everything. On March 25th every year is Frances Glessner Lee's birthday. And they always have some programs. So last year they had a program, and I did a short thing talking about my book with Frances Glessner Lee as the main character in this fictional account. And it turns out the University of Wisconsin at Parkside, there's a woman who teaches a forensics class. And she has every year she does a different one of the crime scenes, but she has the theater department produce a full-size copy of one of these nutshell scenes. And that year they happened to do the one that I had in my book. So they brought it down, and part of the program was they were talking about it. And they had this full-size room that was the dark bathroom and the girl in the bathtub. I'm going back this year and doing it with my second book too. I don't think they have the full-sized thing. They have some other people talking instead. So I talked about the first book. The book 2 is the three-decker murder. So book 2, it's called the two-story porch nutshell. But as I said, it seems that in East Boston, they really had 3-deckers, not 2-deckers. So I changed that. But the basic situation is they find a body, and it appears that she died by falling. She was hanging out laundry, and she died by falling or getting pushed. But then they get the body to the funeral home, and they find out she was shot. So then they have to go back and figure out what happened. So this is in November 1919. Lee and McGrath are going to be the basic people. McGrath is, disturbed as the medical examiner that they moved the body away and then found out that she'd actually been shot. So it introduces a couple of new characters, fictional characters, and the new fictional characters are really the result of the police strike. The police strike happened in September of 1919. And by November, they had blackballed all of the men who went on strike. And they had hired in new people and given them what the strikers were asking for, more money and not having to pay for their uniforms and things like that. So we have one character who's an Irishman who lives there, and he was in the strike, and he's still mad that he got blacklisted and looking for something to do. And then we have a young man who's a Harvard student who they actually recruited Harvard students to go be strikebreakers. And he did that, and then he was interested enough that he didn't go back to Harvard. He stayed, and because he was a Harvard boy, he got a detective's star right away, but he doesn't know what he's doing, and he's the one responsible for the mistake. So those two become characters. It's also set in East Boston, the docks and wharves of East Boston, and that's partly because I wanted to do that. I had done the North End. I wanted to do that. The third book will probably be set in the West End, and also because I had relatives who were there at that time. So my maternal grandfather was a fireman at that time, and they were living in East Boston at that time. And later he got invalided out, and they moved to Clinton, where there were a lot of people from the part of Ireland they had come from. So his wife, who I don't have a picture of, she was quite a character. She had 7 brothers, and then she had 6 sons. So she's a fictional version of her is in this book, and she's a sister of the policeman who got blacklisted. And they're one set, so they're sort of the lower class set. Then my maternal grandfather, he had a company, William H. Ellis and Son, which built docks and wharves. So his father had worked for McKay, who was the shipbuilder who built all the big clipper ships that used to sail over to China. And he had worked for McKay, and then he started his own business. His own business was building docks and wharves. And so I have a family that's roughly based on them. That the old man is still alive, and the son is a potential suspect in the thing. And then my grandmother on that side, she was married to him, and she ran a little newspaper column at that time. And so I have a character that's roughly based on her there. Now, this was just the time like Joe Kennedy was living in East Boston with his kids, but they moved out to Brookline. And these relatives moved out pretty soon after that. They were, like rich Irish at the time, and they moved out to Brookline. And then, of course, the other family, the McNamara family, moved out to Clinton. But they all happened to be in East Boston at that time, so I had to use that. Lots of pictures from them. I also wrote a set of books set in Chicago. They are also historical mysteries. They start in 1893 with the Columbian Exposition, Death at the Fair, and I have a young woman who's from Boston, but she goes to be one of the first women graduate students at the University of Chicago, and she's very excited about that. Women could go to college, and she went to Wellesley College, but then they couldn't do graduate work, so this was opening up for them graduate work. She studies sociology, and at the fair she meets Ida B. Wells, who was doing her anti-lynching campaign. She's a main historical character. She goes to Hull House and works in that settlement house with Jane Addams and Florence Kelly. She's there. There was a strike in Pullman in 1894. And she goes to Woods Hole because the scientists at the University of Chicago were running the marine biological laboratory at Woods Hole at that time. So, and I have a house down the Cape, so you could do an actual tour. And the book starts with finding a body in one of the fish tanks in one of the main things. She goes back to Chinatown, meets a couple of real Chinese women who became doctors at University of Michigan, were in Chicago the summer of 1896, and then went back to China and were famous for running clinics. She gets to go to Paris in 1900 with Bertha Palmer, meets Mary Cassatt at the Paris Exposition. The Death at Celix Studios is some silent movies. They were making them in the eastern part of the country at that time. Outside of Chicago, there were a couple of studios. And right after that, that's at 1908. Right after that, they all moved out to California for the better weather and better light. And then two books based on World War I, Death at the Home Front, just as we're getting into the war in 1917, and then Death of the Spanish Flu, 1918. And that's a picture of the real little crime scene for my Molasses book, which is the first one that I wrote. So there you go. Do you have any questions? Anybody have any questions?
You can either put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, happy to talk to you. I can go back to the
Oh,
screens if you need them.
So we do have one here, Francis. How did the nutshells end up in Maryland again?
Oh, good point. So Francis Glesner Lee died in 1962. I noted that because my father was police commissioner from 62 to 72, so I never heard him mention her, so I don't think that he knew her. But by 1967, Harvard decided they didn't want to do to continue to support the legal medicine. So at that time, a medical examiner's office in Maryland took over the little crime scenes and took them down there. They also took over being the place for the training that was done twice a year, and they continued the training. Now, the man who wrote Bruce Goldfarb, who wrote the book and had been the PR person for medical for the Maryland Medical Examiner's Office, he said they were still using them, but it was interesting. He was on a Zoom talking about his book and Francis Glesner Lee and so forth. And he also brought up the current situation, which is that the medical examiners are in a terrible situation. They have all these bodies and not enough medical examiners, pathologists to deal with them. So they had gotten, really behind, and I think their budget was probably slashed. So he's no longer at the Maryland Medical Examiner's Office. And I don't know, they did, I think last year in 2023, they had one of these seminars that they still have, and they still use the crime scenes for. So it was Harvard. It happens. I worked at University of Chicago, and universities sometimes decide they're not going to support that kind of a school anymore. So that was what happened.
We do have another question here. Are any of your books going to be made into movies?
Yeah, my relatives keep asking me that. Not so far as I know. I go to writers' conferences every year, and that does seem to be a bit of luck. If somebody finds it who happens to be related to somebody who does that kind of thing. So I know people who have had that happen. recent one is Alyssa Maxwell, who writes about Newport, Rhode Island, and she's got a young girl who's sort of like a reporter in the 1890s, and that recently got made into a Hallmark, I think, type thing. So can always hope, but so far not.
Um, and someone says, I love all your books. Are there more coming out in either series?
Yes, I have a first draft and that I need to finish it of a book in the Cabot, and thank you very much for saying you love them, in the Emily Cabot mysteries. I wanted to set one with the Wall Street because those books jump. They jump a number of years. I made that decision. After the first 4 books, my editor said to me, that girl must be exhausted because they all happened within like a year and a half. So I made the choice after that to let them be bigger spaces and let the family grow and so forth. So there's I wanted to set one in the Wall Street crash, but when I went to do the Wall Street crash, that's 1929. It's like just when all the gangsters were happening. Now, my original small publisher, Allium Press, her motto was rescuing Chicago from Capone, one book at a time, because all people knew about when they heard Chicago was Al Capone. So she didn't want gangsters in them, but you can't avoid it for that particular year. So that book will be coming out sometime later this year. It's going to be Death at the Chicago Trust. It does start with a suicide by a banker, but then it goes on to that there's gangsters in it. For the nutshells, yes, I have one I'm working on now, and it's going to be set in the West End of Boston. And that was a really interesting. That's famous for in the 1950s and 60s, they knocked down all the buildings. It was like the North End of Boston, but they knocked down all the buildings and did to rebuild, but then they didn't replace the people. So it's like urban development gone wrong. It's a famous example of that. Although that's where I'm living at the moment in one of the buildings that did wind up there. But it was Leonard Nimoy grew up in the West End of Boston, and in the movie about his life, it was very ethnically diverse. It was full of lots of different people from different backgrounds, and it was very noted for that. So it makes it a really interesting group to write about. So I am writing a book about that now, and I have the potential for more of the nutshells because there are more nutshells to work from. So thanks for asking. Any other questions?
Let's see. How do you write? Paper, computer, and do you listen to period music?
Interesting. I sometimes I'll start on paper, mostly computer. Um, I'm liable to go to period places. A lot of the places in my books are places you can visit. So I worked at University of Chicago, and that was where the Columbian Exposition was on the Midway there. Hull House you can actually go and visit in Chicago. The North End I've always gone to and can walk down to where the tank was. Um, Pullman, the Pullman book, there's a little town of Pullman that you can still visit and that kind of thing. I'm more likely to go to the actual places. Listening to the music is an interesting question. I probably should more, especially as I get into the 20s type of music at that time.
Someone says, yay, more to read. I learned so much from your books.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's well, I get all this extra information, see that makes a good extra thing because you can only put so much of what you know in the books because you distract from the basic story that pulls people along if you don't. You have to be careful with that. That's always a balance. That's always I'm glad. Thank you so much to hear people have read some of the books. I love it.
Any more questions for Frances tonight? All right. Let's see. Mel, go ahead. It looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks so much. I typed in too. How long does it take to write a book? They're well researched. So from that little kernel, that little nugget of an idea, And
Yeah.
then all of the research that you have to do to actually getting it on paper and getting it to your publisher. How long does that take? What's that process like for you?
So I'll start thinking about a book a couple of years ahead of time and start gathering stuff while I'm writing another book, kind of thing. When it gets, and then I do a lot of the research before. A lot of it is newspapers. Online newspapers are really wonderful way, but finding some specific things. I'll do a lot of it before, but then have to stop when I'm doing it. Usually it'll take me half a year to a year. I do have a good writing group of some people who they used to put out an anthology of short stories. They're good editors, and every week or two they'll read some chapters, and I'll go through at least 2 versions with them, and then I'll have a couple of beta readers that I'll have too before I submit it to the editor at the publisher. But the first book was the longest one to write, because the first 3 books were together in one book at first, and then it broke apart and it finally came out to be one book. And after that, it got a little bit more. I was working full time when I was putting out about one a year of the Emily books, and now I might do 2 a year or 1.5 between the Nutshell and the Emily books. So, but I start the research probably earlier than that. Like I knew I wanted one about the West End while I was still working on the North End and East End ones, or I knew I wanted to write one about the Wall Street era for several years before I did it. And the last book in that series I want to be about the World's Fair in 1933 in Chicago, because it starts with the World's Fair, Columbian Exposition. In the middle is the Paris one in 1900, and I'd like to complete the series with the one that was in 1933. Century of Progress was what it was called. So I worked in a library, the University of Chicago Library, so I was like sitting on top of 7 million books. So that made it easier to research. And here I belong to the Boston Athenaeum, so both for researching, especially electronic, because electronic resources cost money. So you want to belong to a university or something like that to be able to do it. So, it varies.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Sounds just like a lot of fun.
It is, for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Are your books in audiobook format?
Unfortunately, they're not. They're not. They might get into audiobook format because I know that Level Best Books that's doing the Nutshells has a contract with some, but they haven't yet. So that is, yeah, too bad, because a lot of people like to listen to those.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm sure Frances would love you to purchase her books, I should say, but we do have them at the West Hartford Public Library.
Great.
They are currently checked out. I just checked, but they should be due, or they are due in a couple of weeks. So if you'd like to take them out, please reserve them now while you have the chance.
All right.
So I want to thank you, Frances, for coming out tonight, and
Okay.
thank you everyone else for coming out. And I hope everyone has a great night.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much.
Good night.
Good night.